The termination letter was dated a Thursday, 48 hours before my vesting cliff. I've told this story to my brother-in-law, to my fishing buddy Archie, to my wife late at night when the house was quiet and she couldn't sleep either. Every time I tell it, people stop me at the same part. They say, "Wait, you already knew? You already had it in writing?" Yes, I had it in writing. That's the whole point. My name is Lawrence Dodd. I spent 19 years as the Director of Clinical Integration at Meridian Health Partners, a regional hospital management group out of Knoxville, Tennessee. We weren't a household name. We weren't a coast operation. We managed 7 community hospitals across the Southeast, the kind of facilities that deliver babies for families who've been coming to the same building for 3 generations. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that gets written up in Forbes, but real work. Work that kept people alive. I started there when my youngest was in kindergarten. She was in her 2nd year of graduate school when the letter landed on my desk. 19 years. I want you to sit with that number for a second before I tell you the rest. When I took the job, Meridian was a 3-hospital group with about $40 million in annual operating revenue. By the time I was done, we had 7 facilities, a regional diagnostic network, and a proprietary care coordination platform I had spent 4 years building from scratch with a team of 8 people. We called it ClearPath. It was, and I say this without ego because the numbers say it for me, the reason Meridian was worth anything at all to anyone outside of Tennessee. ClearPath reduced average patient transfer time by 31%. It cut readmission penalties by $2.2 million annually across the network. It was the thing that made us look like a technology company to the healthcare private equity firms that started circling us in 2022. I knew they were circling. I was the one who took the first meetings. Here's what you need to understand about the way I came to work at Meridian. Because it matters. I didn't come up through hospital administration the normal way. I came from the software side. I'd spent 6 years at a health IT firm before a recruiter called me about this director role. The founder of Meridian, a man named Charles Oberg, was old school. Ex-military, no nonsense. Built the company with his own hands and his own capital. He respected people who built things. We understood each other immediately. 2 years in, Charles and I had a conversation over bad coffee in his office that changed everything. He told me he wanted to modernize the way the facilities communicated. Patient data, transfer protocols, billing flags. He said he'd tried to hire consultants and the proposals always came back generic. He said he thought I could actually build it. I told him I could. I also told him what I'd need in exchange. It wasn't a complicated ask. I wanted a clause in my employment contract specifying that if and when Meridian was acquired or went through a material change of ownership, and if ClearPath had been a documented factor in the valuation, I would receive 15% of the platform's assessed value at closing, provided I was still employed on the date that payment cleared. Charles looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Get it to legal by Friday." We signed the amendment 11 days later. I have a copy in a fireproof box in my garage. I have a digital copy in my email, in a folder I've never deleted. I have a 3rd copy with my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who has been practicing contract law in Knoxville for 30 years, and who told me when she reviewed it that it was one of the cleaner clauses she'd seen from a non-lawyer. 3 copies. Always 3. I'm telling you this not to sound clever. I'm telling you because the next part of this story only makes sense if you understand that I had been living with that clause for 17 years by the time any of this happened. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't the trap I set. It was an agreement, signed in good faith, that both parties understood. At least I thought both parties understood. Charles retired in the fall of 2021. His health had been declining. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of a man in his mid-70s who'd spent 4 decades running on adrenaline and diner food. He handed operational control to his daughter, Stephanie. I want to be fair here because I've had 3 years to think about it, and fairness still matters to me. Stephanie was not a bad person. She was sharp, actually. An MBA from Vanderbilt, 10 years in healthcare finance before she came back to take over the family business. She and I had a professional relationship that was respectful, if not warm. She called me Lawrence. I called her Stephanie. We agreed on the important things and kept our disagreements brief. What she was, though, was someone who had grown up watching her father run this company and who had very clear ideas about what the company was and who had built it. In her version of the history, I think I was a capable employee. A long-tenured, valuable employee. But an employee. The clause in my contract was something she knew about. It was disclosed to her when she took over, as it should have been. I don't believe she thought much about it. The acquisition conversations were still theoretical in 2021. ClearPath was an internal tool, not a line item on a term sheet. It probably felt abstract. It stopped being abstract in January of 2023, when a private equity firm called Halloran Capital began serious acquisition discussions. They were consolidating regional hospital networks across the Southeast and Midwest, building toward a portfolio that could compete with the national chains. They had already acquired 2 groups in Georgia and the Carolinas. I was in the room for every meeting. I built the data room. I prepared the ClearPath documentation, the outcome metrics, the integration specifications, the scalability analysis. I knew what we were worth because I spent 4 months making sure the buyers knew what we were worth. The platform was assessed at $38 million in the preliminary valuation. 15% of $38 million is $5.7 million. I'm not going to pretend I didn't do the math. Of course I did the math. I also kept doing my job. Every day, the same as always. Because that's who I am. That's who I had been for 19 years. Closing was scheduled for a Friday in March. The payment would clear, per the acquisition agreement, on that date. I want to be precise. The clause in my contract required that I be employed on the payment date, not on the signing date, not on the announcement date. On the day the money moved, the Wednesday before closing, 48 hours out, I was called into Stephanie's office at 2 in the afternoon. Her CFO was there. So was the head of HR. A man I'll call by his first name only, Davis, because he was doing what he was told, and I don't carry any particular bitterness toward him. Stephanie was behind her desk. She did not offer me a seat. She told me the company was restructuring the executive team in anticipation of the transition. She told me my role was being eliminated. She told me my employment was terminated, effective immediately, and that I would receive 60 days of severance per company policy. She slid the termination letter across the desk. My name was at the top. The date was stamped across the middle. I picked it up. I read it. I set it back down. I said, "Stephanie, I need you to understand what you're doing here." She said, "I understand it, Lawrence. This is a business decision." I said, "No. I mean legally. I need you to understand the contract clause." Davis started to say something about the severance package. I held up one hand, not rudely, just wait. I looked at Stephanie and I said, "The clause requires active employment on the date of payment. That's this Friday. If you terminate me today, the clause doesn't disappear. The obligation doesn't disappear. You're triggering a breach." She said, "Our legal team has reviewed the agreement." I said, "Then their recommendation must have included a significant liability disclosure, because what you're describing is a breach of a signed contract that is part of a disclosed acquisition. Halloran's legal team has a copy of my employment agreement. It was in the data room." There was a pause, not a long one, maybe 3 seconds. She said, "This meeting is concluded. Please collect your personal belongings. Security will assist you." I picked up my phone. I picked up my briefcase. I walked out of the building. I did not clean out my desk that day. I had very little personal property in my office. I'd learned a long time ago not to settle too deeply into a space you don't own. A photo of my wife and me from a trip to Asheville, a coffee mug my son had given me years ago with a stupid Joe printed on the side that still made me smile every morning. I left both behind. I figured I'd get them eventually. I drove home. My wife was in the kitchen when I walked in. She looked at my face and said, "What happened?" I told her. She sat down at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said, "Call Patricia." I called Patricia. Patricia picked up on the second ring. I gave her the facts, all of them in order. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Lawrence, where is the Halloran agreement in terms of execution?" I told her closing was scheduled Friday, funds transfer Friday afternoon. She said, "And your clause is in the data room?" "Yes." She said, "Then they have a problem. A serious one. Call me back in an hour." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table with my wife, and we drank coffee and didn't say very much. I've been married for 26 years. We've sat through hard things before. A health scare of mine back in 2014 that turned out to be nothing. A rough patch in the business that nearly cost us our savings. The year our older son had trouble that I won't detail here because it's not my story to tell. We know how to sit quietly together when things are uncertain. Patricia called back in 50 minutes. She'd already spoken with her litigation partner and had reviewed the clause language again herself. She said, the termination creates a breach. There's no ambiguity in the language. They owe you the payment as a matter of contract, and the termination doesn't void the obligation. It triggers it. We need to send a formal notice tonight to Meridian Legal, and we need to notify Halloran's acquisition counsel directly. Halloran needs to know there is a disputed contractual obligation sitting in the middle of their closing. I said, will they delay? She said, they might stop entirely. A $38 million platform with a disputed ownership clause is not something a serious PE firm closes around. They will pause to assess their exposure. I said, okay, do it. Patricia sent the notice at 9:47 that evening. 2 pages, clear language, my contract attached, the specific clause highlighted, the timeline of events laid out factually. She sent it to Meridian's general counsel, to the acquisition counsel named in the transaction documents, and directly to the managing partner of Halloran Capital. I went to bed at 11. I slept better than I had any right to. Thursday morning, my phone began ringing at 7:15. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man who identified himself as Halloran's outside counsel. He was very controlled and very professional, and he asked me to return his call at my earliest convenience. I called Patricia first. She said, don't talk to them without me on the line. Conference me in. We called Halloran's counsel together at 8:30. He confirmed they had received Patricia's notice. He confirmed the clause had been in the data room and had been identified during due diligence. He said, and I'll paraphrase because I'm not going to reproduce legal conversation verbatim, that Halloran was pausing the closing pending resolution of the contractual issue. He asked if there was a path to resolution. Patricia said there was. Meridian could reinstate my employment retroactively through Friday, allow the payment to clear per the original agreement, and then we could proceed from there as all parties saw fit. There was a pause on the line. Then he said he would convey that to his client. I hung up and looked at my wife across the kitchen table. She raised her eyebrows. I said, they paused the closing. She put her hand over her mouth for a second. Then she said, good. Stephanie called me at 11:14 that Thursday morning. I remember the time because I was in the backyard throwing a ball for our old dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, who has since passed and who I still think about every day, and I heard my phone and went inside to check it. Stephanie's voice was controlled. She was good at controlled. She said, Lawrence, we need to talk about the situation. I said, my attorney's handling communications on my behalf. I can give you her number. She said, I'd prefer to speak with you directly. I said, I understand that, but given the circumstances, I think it's better if we keep this professional and documented. Patricia Ostrander, I'll text you her number. Stephanie said nothing for 2 seconds. Then, fine. I texted her Patricia's number and went back outside to throw the ball for Biscuit. The negotiations took most of Thursday. I wasn't in them. Patricia was. What I know is what she told me afterward. Meridian's position initially was that my termination was valid and the clause was unenforceable due to a technicality involving the definition of payment date. Patricia's position was that the clause language was unambiguous, the documentation trail was clear, and any attempt to argue the technicality in court would be expensive, time-consuming, and, more relevantly, would become part of the public record of an acquisition that Halloran needed to close quietly. Halloran's attorney, I'm told, was not warm toward Meridian by the end of the day. At 4:37 p.m. Thursday, Patricia called me. She said, they're reinstating you effective immediately, on paper, through Friday's closing. The payment will clear as agreed. They want a mutual release of claims signed by end of day Friday. I said, and the severance? She said, they're offering to keep the 60 days in addition. I said, okay. She said, Lawrence, you're going to be fine. I know. I knew it before she called. Not because I was certain of the outcome. You're never certain. But because I had done everything right, not to win, not to trap anyone. I had done everything right because that's what you do when you spend 19 years building something. You protect the work. You document the agreements. You trust the structure. Friday afternoon, the payment cleared. $5.7 million, less taxes, less Patricia's fees, less a few other things I won't detail here because they're between me and my accountant. What remained was enough to change things. Not everything, but things. The first person I called after Patricia confirmed the transfer was my wife. She cried a little, which she won't want me to say, but which is true, and I sat in the car in the bank parking lot a letter. The second person I called was my brother-in-law. He said, I told you that clause was a golden ticket. I had to remind him that he'd said nothing of the sort for about 15 years, and had in fact once called it excessive at a Thanksgiving dinner. He laughed. I didn't feel the surge of satisfaction I thought I'd feel. I thought I'd feel vindicated, like the score was settled, the ledger balanced. What I felt instead was something quieter. Tired, mostly. Grateful. A little sad for the thing that had ended, which was 19 years of my life with a company I had genuinely loved building, and which was now going to be absorbed into a private equity portfolio and administered from an office in Atlanta by people who would never know what it had taken to make it what it was. But that's how it goes sometimes. You build something, it gets sold. The world moves on. My daughter called that evening. She's finishing her residency, pediatrics, down in Birmingham. And she'd known something was happening because I'd been vague on the phone all week, which is not like me. I told her the full story, start to finish. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Dad, you kept that contract for 19 years in a fireproof box. I said, 3 copies. She laughed. She said, 3 copies. Then she said, Dad, that's the most you thing I've ever heard. I don't know what that says about me. I think it says I grew up in a family where you read things before you signed them, and where you kept what mattered, and where you understood that work and trust and documented agreements were not separate things but the same thing. My father was a mechanic. He ran his own shop for 31 years. He always said, the invoice is the relationship. If you can't put it in writing, you don't have an agreement, you have a wish. I've thought about that a lot over the past couple of years. The skit passed about 8 months after all this, which I mention only because there's a version of the story where I went back to that backyard one morning to throw the ball, and the yard was quiet, and I stood there thinking about what 19 years of loyalty looks like, in a dog and in a person, and how the world doesn't always give it back to you the way you gave it. But sometimes it does. Sometimes you put the right thing in writing at the right moment, and 17 years later, it stands up in the middle of a $285 million acquisition, and the number on the wire transfer says, yes, this mattered. What you built, what you agreed to, what you protected, it mattered. My wife and I drove up to the Smokies the following weekend. Nothing special. A cabin we'd been talking about renting for years and kept putting off. We sat on the porch in the mornings and watched the fog come off the ridgeline and drank coffee, and didn't need to say very much. That's the part I keep coming back to when I tell this story. Not the wire transfer. Not Patricia's call. Not even the moment Stephanie's voice on the phone told me, without saying it directly, that she understood she had miscalculated. The porch. The fog. My wife's hand on the armrest of the chair next to mine. That's the part that was worth protecting. I think about my father's shop a lot these days. Not the smell of it. Not the tools. The invoice book. He kept it on the counter by the register, a spiral-bound thing with carbon paper, and every job got written down before the work started. He used to say, the invoice is the relationship. If you can't put it in writing, you don't have an agreement, you have a wish. I didn't fully understand that when I was young. I understand it completely now. What happened to me wasn't luck. I want to be honest about that, because the easy version of this story is that I got lucky, that I happened to add the right clause, that the timing worked out, that Patricia happened to pick up the phone, but luck doesn't sign a contract amendment and then protect it in a fireproof box for 17 years. That's something else. That's deciding, quietly and without fanfare, that the work you're doing is worth taking seriously enough to protect. When I sat across from Stephanie and her CFO and Davis from HR, I wasn't calm because I was brave. I was calm because I had done the right things over a very long time and I knew it. There's a kind of steadiness that comes from that. Not arrogance, just clarity. You know what you built. You know what you signed. You know what's true. I've thought about Stephanie a lot since then, and I don't think she was malicious. I think she looked at me and saw a long-tenured employee with a complicated clause and made a calculation that the clause was manageable and the closing was worth more than the exposure. She was wrong, but not because she was cruel. She was wrong because she underestimated what careful people do over long stretches of time. She underestimated the invoice book. That's the part I want anyone watching this to take away, not the dollar amount, not the legal mechanics. It's this. The outcomes in your life are almost never random. They're the accumulated result of how you've conducted yourself, how carefully you've thought things through, and whether you've had the persistence to maintain your integrity when nobody was watching and nothing was at stake yet. Doing right by people, thinking clearly under pressure, and holding your ground when the easier path is to walk away. Those three things don't always pay off immediately. Sometimes they sit in a fireproof box for 17 years, but they don't disappear. They compound, and when the moment comes, and the moment always comes, they're there. I'm sitting on a porch in the Smokies in my memory, coffee going cold in my hand, fog on the ridgeline, my wife quiet next to me. That's what 19 years of doing the work the right way looks like. Not a wire transfer, not a legal victory. A porch, a morning. The knowledge that when it counted, you were the person you always meant to be. That's the part you can't put a number on, but it's also the part that lasts.